waiting for you. Come and join us now. We need you with us. Come and join us now.
Band, Genesis. Album, From Genesis to Revelation. Label, Decca 1969. Tracks on the album. Side A, track first, Where the Sour Turns to Sweet. Side A, track second, In the Beginning. Side A, track third, Fireside Song. Side A, track fourth, The Serpent. Side A, track fifth, Am I Very Wrong? Side A, track 6, In the Wilderness. Side B, track first, The Conqueror. Side B, track second, In Hiding. Side B, track third, One Day. Side B, track fourth, Window. Side B, track fifth, In Limbo. Side B, track sixth, Silent Sun. Side B, track seventh, A Place to Call My Own. Release date, March 7th, 1969. Recorded at Regent Sound Studios, Soho, London in 1968 by Brian Roberts and Tom Alamy. Producer, Jonathan King. Band lineup, Peter Gabriel, lead vocals, flute, tambourine. Anthony Phillips, electric and acoustic guitars, vocals. Anthony Banks, keyboards, acoustic guitar, vocals. Michael Rutherford, acoustic guitars, bass guitar, vocals. John Silver, drums, percussion, except on Silent Sun. Chris Stewart, drums on Silent Sun, not credited on the original release. David Thomas, backing vocals, not credited on the original release. Arthur Greenslade, string arrangements. Lou Warburton, brass arrangements at the making of the album, From Genesis to Revelation. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Brit Ain is about to begin. With these words, on June 18, 1940, Prime Minister Winston Churchill confirmed that Britain's policy of stubborn resistance and of blood, toil, tears, and sweat was to continue. Following the defeat of France, Hitler's Nazi Germany was convinced Great Britain was on the verge of seeking a peace agreement. But Churchill's indignant refusal, relying on British patriotism, meant Germany was forced to plan an invasion by sea. Operation Sea Lion, Unternehmen Seelow, as it was called, envisaged launching several attacks from the French coast, but Great Britain was anything but unprepared. The RAF brilliantly succeeded in maintaining control over the English Channel, forcing Hitler to abandon his invasion plans indefinitely. Around this time, 22-year-old Edwin Phillips, one of many young men called up to serve king and country, was part of a small group of soldiers undertaking reconnaissance in Dunkirk. Many of his comrades were killed, and he was hit in the leg by a bullet. Luckily for him, the bullet went straight through, leaving him injured but still able to walk, albeit with a little help. So when British and Allied troops were evacuated, he was able to get away, unlike the less fortunate non-walking wounded who had to be left behind. Just a few months earlier, while waiting to be called up, Phillips, like so many soldiers at that time, had married. Knowing that once they reached the front there was a strong chance of never making it back home, it became common practice for soldiers to marry their sweethearts. Marriage became a desperate attempt to cling on to life, enjoying every last remnant of freedom, trying to imagine a happy future on their return after the war was won. But when World War II finally ended and Edwin Phillips came home, too many things had changed, and not even baby and born while her father was at the front was enough to hold the young family together. Shortly afterwards, Edwin met another woman, much younger than himself, whom he married in March 1951. On December 23rd that same year, she gave birth to a son, Anthony Edwin Phillips, in a hospital in Putney, South London. Anthony Phillips' story isn't very different to that of the friends he would meet during his adolescence who together would change their lives and make a part of rock history. After all, those born at the dawn of the 50s were all post-war children, a generation brought up with the greatest of fears dictated not only by the conflict itself, but also by considerations which up until then had never been put into focus, such as the level of collective folly-sick ideologies like Nazism could reach, or the worrying advances in technology which could also be applied to weapons of mass destruction. And yet, in post-war England, the desire to start again prevailed, a barely suppressed yearning to get back to living after somic fear, death, and destruction, and to rebuild the foundations of a decent life. Putting the war behind him, Edwin Phillips became the archetypal middle-class Englishman absorbed in his work, to which he dedicated all of his time in order to ensure the well-being of his family. Anthony Phillips, my father, worked in the city. He was a very successful banker, and later on in life he moved on from having the one job to what we call diversifying. He became chairman of a number of big companies like Higgs and Hill, construction company, and Friends Provident, an insurance company. He did really well. He was a very successful man. His wife, Pauline, on the other hand, took care of the home. Phillips, nowadays all the roles have changed, everyone shares things. In those days it was quite unusual for a woman to work. The man went to work and the mother looked after the kids. Men did nothing in the house at all. None of my father's friends had wives who worked. It was fairly common practice, among better-off families, to send their children to public schools, where they believed they would benefit from a superior education and be better prepared for later life. In a generation still getting over the traumas of war, there was little time for fuss and affection, and children got used to looking after themselves from a very early age. Phillips, when I was 8 years old, I got sent to boarding school. These schools often started originally because you had a lot of people in the forces. During the British Empire, you had people in India and all over the world, and they wanted to have somewhere for their children to stay and be educated. It wasn't because parents didn't want their children at home. They thought this was where you got the best education and that it made you tough, made you a man. So you were sent away to this place, and you didn't see your parents for 3 or 4 weeks, which was pretty frightening actually. The situation was made even more unpleasant due to the pupil-teacher relationship. Phillips, 1960 wasn't that long after the war, which ended in 1945. Some teachers had been in the war, and some of them had bits missing. Some of them would get you by the hair if you didn't understand something right away. I was very unhappy to start with. You didn't see your parents very much, so it drove a wedge between you and them. It was a real shock for an 8-year-old boy who had never been away from home. But after 2 or 3 years it was okay. You couldn't really tell your parents you weren't happy because you didn't want them to go and talk to the school. You had to be a man, you had to be tough. Crawford Rutherford was also a military man. A captain in the Royal Navy, he was constantly moving up and down the country taking his family, including the young Michael John Chloe Crawford Rutherford, with him. Born on October 2, 1950, at the age of 7.5, Mike was sent to the Lees Preparatory School in Hoylake on the Wirral Peninsula, Cheshire. Here, due to the distance, he would rarely see his parents. Anthony George Banks, born on March 27, 1950, was sent to the Borzell Tutorial College in Hurst Green, East Sussex, before moving to Hastings.
Tony Banks. In this country we have public schools as opposed to private schools that require an entrance exam to get in. My father, John, taught a number of subjects to 13-year-old boys, the ones who had failed to get in the first time round, so that they could get into the school of their choice, such as Eton. Basically he was teaching rich kids how to get into those schools. But he had already retired from doing that by the time we moved to Hastings. He just wanted to move to a smaller house, and he was a chicken farmer for a while after that. Peter Brian Gabriel, born February 13, 1950, had a slightly different childhood. His father, Ralph, whose family had run a profitable timber business, excelled in the field of science, graduating in electronic engineering. He even played a part in some important inventions, including the first fiber-optic cable television system. He had moved into the countryside, where he first sent Peter to an independent school in Woking, Cable House, and then to the St. Andrew's School for Boys, from where he could cycle home every weekend. Anthony, Mike, Tony, Peter. For boys whose paths were set to cross, between September 1963 and April 1965, at Charterhouse, the austere public school, just a few miles from the centre of Godalming, Surrey. A place where teachers were very authoritarian and where life in a boarding school forced them to deal with a reality not only marked by a lack of family affection, but also one of bullying from some teachers and older boys. Fellow Charterhouse student, Christopher Stewart, born in Crawley, March 27, 1951, who soon began to work with the Four Friends, says, "I detested public school. I hated the people, I hated the routine, I hated the very idea of college. I went back there a couple of years ago and, to be honest, I thought it was an amazing place, but the setup just wasn't right for me. It didn't do me any harm, if anything it made me a better person. Booty hated it. It was just like you read and see in the film If, 1968, it was like something out of the 1800s. Two things kept the boys afloat, sport and music. Sport gave them the chance to vent their growing angst through competition, whilst music let their minds wander and open up to art. And so this is the educational and socio-cultural context that gave birth to the legend we call Genesis. It was in the classrooms of Charterhouse that the idea of a band began to form in the minds of the four young friends. The most precocious, musically speaking, was the youngest, guitar player Anthony Phillips, and to his friends. The curiously named Rivers Job, Anthony's friend since St. Edmund's Preparatory School in Hindhead, played bass, whilst singer Richard McPhail and drummer Rob Tyrrell both came from Charterhouse. Together with Mike Rutherford on rhythm guitar, the five formed a band called Anon, short for Anonymous. Despite being just 13 years old, and was already writing simple songs which Anon alternated with covers of classic rock songs, particularly by the Rolling Stones. As with any young band, Anon went through numerous lineup changes. When Rutherford's housemaster banned him from playing guitar, he was replaced by Mick Coleman. Anthony was also in another band outside Charterhouse, Spoken Word, which in 1966 recorded a cover of Evening by Jimmy Witherspoon on acetate with the following lineup: David Thomas, vocals, Ronnie Gunn, piano, Jeremy Enser, bass guitar, David Chadwick, guitar, and Peter Gabriel, drums. In the meantime, Gabriel had also become great friends with Tony Banks in another wing of Charterhouse. The two used to fight over the only piano available in the school until they eventually came to a compromise, Tony on keyboards and Peter on vocals. These young musicians all came together in the summer of '66 when Anon's lead singer, Richard McPhail, organized an end-of-year concert at Charterhouse. The program for the Beat Club concert included 3 bands, the most important of which was, of course, Anon, which featured the following lineup: Phillips, McPhail, Job, Tyrrell, and Coleman. Rutherford, who in the meantime had managed to get his guitar band lifted by his housemaster, played with Climax, while the third band, Garden Wall, featured Banks and Gabriel, drummer Chris Stewart, and trombonist Johnny Trapman, with the help of Philip and Job for the actual stage performance as they didn't have a guitarist or bass player. Shortly after the Beat Club concert, Anon, with a reinstated Mike Rutherford in the place of Coleman, recorded the track Pennsylvania Flick House at the Tony Pike Studio in Putney, which was printed on 6 acetate discs, one for each member of the band and one for sound engineer and friend, Brian Roberts. This gem, a beat piece similar in style to the Rolling Stones, would see the light of day in November 2011 on a CD single issue to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the Genesis fan club in Germany. At the end of the year, however, both McPhail and Job left Charterhouse and consequently the band. For a while, Anon continued as a 3-piece with Mike switching to bass guitar and lead vocals. After the trio's last concert in December 1966, Anon finally called it a day. During the 1966 Christmas holidays, Ant and Mike found themselves writing songs together at Mike's grandmother's house, and there they planned to cut a demo in Brian Roberts' studio. This was the first step in one of the most amazing musical adventures in the history of rock. A dream called Genesis. It was April 1967 when Brian Roberts opened up his studio doors to Anthony and Mike, ready to record 3 brand new songs: Try a Little Sadness, Listen on 5, and That's Me, along with 2 other songs from Anon's old repertoire, Don't Want You Back and Patricia. They decided to add some piano to the recordings and asked Tony Banks of Garden Wall for help. Tony brought Peter Gabriel along with him and, in exchange for playing piano, asked to record a demo of the song Shay's Beautiful, which he had written with Gabriel. As Peter had a far better voice than Ant, who, in the meantime, had taken over from Mike on lead vocals, the young Peter Gabriel ended up singing on all the songs and playing drums on the instrumental track. A school friend called Jonathan Alexander handed the demo tape over to record producer, and Charterhouse alumnus, Jonathan King. Alexander, it fell to me to give it to Jonathan King when he visited the school whilst the others stayed out of the way. I wasn't convinced Hugh would listen to it, especially when I told him that it was basically a band with no name yet. Although only 20 years old and still a student at a university, King had achieved considerable success in the music business and was a minor celebrity at Charterhouse. King, I had just had a huge #1 hit, Everyone's Gone to the Moon, and instead of following it up with another vocal release, I went into the studio with a Cambridge group, Hedgehoppers Anonymous. They couldn't play, so I used all the session men. I wanted to become a record producer. Being a pop star was more of a hobby. My interest was producing. I'd written a song called It's Good News Week and produced them singing it instead of myself. Not only did I have my first hit as a producer with it, but I made loads more money. Going back in triumph to Charterhouse, in my little Austin Healey Sprite car, this lad gave me the tape and said, "This is the school group. They don't have a name." Driving back, I listened to the tape and loved Peter's voice. I decided to produce them by the time I got home in London. King called Peter Gabriel and asked the band to give him something else to listen to. King, it was quite hard getting through to Peter. One phone in each house. 60 boys. There were a dozen houses in the school. I'd been in Davy Sites. They were in Duckites, the nickname for Girdlestonites, I think because Mr. Girdlestone, the original housemaster, walked like a duck. So I had to phone and ask whoever answered to fetch Peter. I think 2 or 3 boys said, yes, then just hung up, couldn't be bothered. Eventually, I got Peter. In the summer of '67, the 4 musicians recorded a second demo at Regent Sound Studios in London with 4 songs, 2 of which were newer versions of those recorded just a few months earlier, She Is Beautiful, Try a Little Sadness, Image Blown Out, and Where the Sour Turns to Sweet. Peter Gabriel, I was 17 in 1967, an amazing year to be entering adulthood. I'd sneak out from school and go down to the Electric Garden in Covent Garden, a sort of basement club. You'd see all these oil projections on the wall, all this psychedelia, really, and that was just the Indica Gallery. There was just so much going on, IT and Oz magazines. There was this cultural explosion happening, and this sense that youth, for the very first time, was taking over the world. Every barrier was being smashed down, and we, in our small, isolated cell, definitely felt connected to that, I think I probably more than everybody else. This sense of trying to do things in a new way, in a different way, was very important. You had all sorts of groups working to explore things. On the folk side, there was Fairport Convention and Family. Then you had the Beatles, obviously, and lots of different influences, and there was still a core of black music. I had a passion for soul music, while Tony, Mike, and I all liked English blues, although they more than I. Back in Regent Sound Studios, in the autumn of '67, a third demo was recorded with 8 new songs: The Mystery of the Flannan Lighthouse, Hidden in the World of Dawn, Hair on the Arms and Legs, CB, Barnaby's Adventure, From Shapes to Shadows, Lost in a Drawer, 14 Years Too Long, which, however, proved not to be to Jonathan King's liking. Gabriel, from the beginning, we set out as songwriters and were quite happy to be writing what were effectively pop songs. But I think there was always a yearning inside us to explore, to push the boundaries and mix styles, and so we started to get a little more adventurous. We were rehearsing and building an identity and a sound, but for Jonathan King and our publisher, Joe Roncaroni, it got too out of mainstream, too left field. King, they weren't very good instrumentally. Just learning. Very ambitious but self-indulgent. Lots of long solos that went out of tune, rambled, were boring, and unstructured. I made them cut the length, sharpen up, tighten the tunes and lyrics, and not play things they weren't able to play yet. They needed to learn and develop. Phillips, ironically, in the very early days, we used to write verse-chorus songs. After Jonathan King signed us, we used to do these kinds of 5-minute epics with lots of sections, but he would talk about hit singles, which is fair enough. He wanted to make money out of us, so we wrote Silent Sun. Disappointed by the lack of enthusiasm shown for their marked creative growth, Peter and Tony deliberately wrote Silent Sun in order. As the band remembers, to emulate the Bee Gees, one of King's favorite groups. King, the Bee Gees thing has grown out of the reality. The album I actually gave them was Crosby, Stills, and Young. Simple, acoustic songs meant they had to strip down the sound, stay in tune, and not try to play things they couldn't yet play. That was the reason I wanted softer pop stuff. And I loved The Silent Sun. It showed off Peter's voice at his best. In fact, King must be mistaken in this matter, as the first Crosby, Stills and Nash, not Crosby, Stills and Young, album was only released in May 1969. The first international release by the Bee Gees was in 1967, so it may be that the band's account is correct. In any case, the plan had worked. The producer liked the song and managed to get the band signed to Decca Records, the same label as the Rolling Stones. Needing a drummer, Genesis brought in Chris Stewart, one of Peter and Tony's Garden Wall bandmates, and together they recorded Silent Sun and a song by Phillips, That's Me, for a single released in February 1968, which, however, failed to arouse any real interest. The same went for their second 45, released in May, with two more songs written by Gabriel and Banks, A Winter's Tale and One-Eyed Hound. In the midst of all of this, in March to be precise, Genesis found time to record another demo at Central Sound in London, which featured the tracks, Hey, I'm Here, Who 30 Park Time, and There Was a Movement.
In the meantime, King had decided the band needed to be put to the test with a full album. So, in the summer of '68, after recording 3 more tracks in Robert's studio in Chiswick, Everywhere Is Here, You've Got to Be Perfect, and Humanity, Genesis went into Regent Sound Studios and recorded a total of 12 songs, most of which were to end up in revised versions on the debut album. One Day, In the Beginning, Image Blown Out, The Magic of Time, In the Wilderness, Am I Very Wrong? In Limbo, Wandering, Fireside Song, A Place to Call My Own, Visions of Angels, Where the Sour Turns to Sweet. For this recording, alongside Gabriel, Banks, Phillips, and Rutherford, the band lineup included new drummer Jonathan John Silver, born in Oxford, February 22, 1949, who took over from Stewart, who had been fired by Jonathan King. Chris Stewart, now a successful author. King didn't like me, and I didn't like him. King threw me out, which was actually the right thing to do, mainly because I wasn't a great drummer, but also because he wanted us to go professional and Westerted working like a real band. I was still at school though, and there was no way my parents were going to let me leave. Making a record was the most exciting thing that could have happened to me. I was 15 or 16, and I went from school to a recording studio in London in the 1960s. In the end, I was, of course, really upset. You start dreaming of becoming a rock star, and then, all of a sudden, it's gone. That said, I wasn't upset for long because they gave me £300, which at that time was a massive amount of money. When Genesis entered the recording studio in the summer of '68, they had several weeks behind them spent composing new songs in their homes, left empty by their parents away on holiday. Phillips, some of the songs were The Sour Turns to Sweet, She Is Beautiful, The Serpent, One Day, were written earlier. We started at John Silver's house in Oxford, then went to David Thomas's house, a friend and supporter of the band, and then my parents' house. There wouldn't have been that much time because we broke up from school at the end of June, so we probably had just a couple of weeks, maybe 10 days, at each of those places. We did some demos at Brian Roberts' house. That was tragic because then he moved and left all those tapes in the attic, and somebody threw them away, which is a pity because somewhere he had a whole lot of Genesis demos. I wonder what they sounded like. It would have been fascinating to have heard those demos. Banks. The original intention was that other people would do the songs we wrote, but when no one else wanted to do them, we modified them a bit so they fit this kind of broad concept we had, and we recorded them just after we left school. They were very simple songs. We never played live or anything. I played mainly piano on the album. Phillips. I suppose you could analyze it as being a piano-based album, because Tony obviously played piano and interpreted Peter's stuff on piano. Mike and I were very much on the sidelines, although I wrote more. Rutherford. My parents, bless them, were supportive. I'm sure they were hoping it wouldn't last. However, in all fairness, in those days parents had no idea you could have a career making pop music. It hadn't really been seen. So in a sense, I think they were very good and very brave in supporting me. In the end, 12 songs were selected, which together with Silent Sun, in the version recorded a few months earlier with Chris Stewart, made a total of 13 tracks in all. In other words, quite a few songs were left out, including the first version of Going Out to Get You, a song which would be resurrected, along with a number of others, years later to be included in the Genesis Archive 1967-75 box set, released June 22, 1998. Phillips, The Magic of Time, Build Me a Mountain and Visions of Angels were going to be on the album, but got left off. Visions of Angels just didn't work out at all. There was another song from the same time, Everywhere Is Here, that was pretty, but the demo never survived. I don't know why Build Me a Mountain got left off. I thought it was quite good.
The album From Genesis to Revelation was recorded in the summer of 1968, an extraordinarily volatile year punctuated by dramatic political events. In the space of just 2 months, between April and June, both Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. And by marked cultural unrest, which culminated in the May '68 uprising in France. But the young and budding Genesis showed no signs of being part of that incredible period of social ferment. On the contrary, while the hippie philosophy managed to survive on the album in a few images tightly linked to the desire for spiritual communion, as in the opening track, where the sour turns to sweet, most of the lyrics put together by Gabriel and the band address the birth of the world as a tribute to the band's name. Genesis is, after all, the first book in the Bible describing creation, original sin, and the flood in its opening chapters. Without pushing the boundaries too far, Genesis put together, and not without a certain measure of chaos, several scholastic and religious reminiscences. In the beginning, for example, uses naive imagery to describe the moment when an ocean of motion creates the land, scattering mountains all around, while the serpent uses the biblical reference of the reptilian tempter to outline the creation of man and woman, which then finds its sublimation in the concluding "a place to call my own," sung from the point of view of a child being born. Not everything on the album is strictly linked to the biblical concept. Am I Very Wrong? Cites The Happiness Machine, taken from the novel by American sci-fi writer Ray Bradbury, whereas in other places, themes touch on the predatory ambitions of man the conqueror and the admiring contemplation of nature in hiding, reserving a special place, of course, to the topic of love. One Day, Silent Sun. Musically speaking, however, Genesis found themselves blown out of the water by some of the biggest names in rock history who were, at that time, churning out one masterpiece after another on both sides of the Atlantic. Over in America, Simon and Garfunkel released not only the soundtrack to The Graduate but also their fourth studio album, Bookends. The Velvet Underground brought out White Light White Heat, Frank Zappa, We're Only in It for the Money, Joni Mitchell, Song to a Seagull, The Doors, Waiting for the Sun, and the Grateful Dead Anthem of the Sun, and Europe responded with just as much creative fervor. Pink Floyd had brought in David Gilmour to replace Syd Barrett on guitar for the album A Saucerful of Secret. But Genesis were particularly interested in the bands that inspired them most. The Beatles, approaching their inevitable demise, released the Double White Album, while the Moody Blues and Procol Harum both brought out their second albums, respectively, In Search of the Lost Chord and Shine On Brightly. And just as Genesis were heading into the recording studio, Family also appeared on the scene, bringing out their debut album Music in a Doll's House along with Jethro Tull, This Was, and Traffic, who released their self-titled second album. In 1968, Buffalo Springfield split up, as did the Yardbirds, which gave us the New Yardbirds, a band which would soon change its name to Led Zeppelin. And the bands Yes and Black Sabbath also formed in 1968. Released into the very midst of this extraordinary music scene, From Genesis to Revelation fared the best it could, which was very little. The writing on the album leaves a lot to be desired. The more prolific songwriting pair, Banks and Gabriel, wrote more than half of the songs, the rest coming from Anthony Phillips, with a small contribution from Mike Rutherford. There were a few minor and occasional reciprocal incursions between the two composing pairs, but for the most part, they worked separately. The songs inevitably reveal, first and foremost, a heavy Beatles influence, as well as some slightly more structured compositions along the lines of Procol Harum and the Moody Blues. The latter had just had a massive hit with Nights in White Satin, enriched with a symphonic arrangement. This may be why Jonathan King was convinced that the songs needed dressing up with some orchestral parts as opposed to them being left as otherwise simple songs, primarily performed on piano, accompanied by some acoustic rhythm guitars and soft drumming. The budget, however, was not one with which miracles could be worked. In fact, the limited number of audio tracks available made it necessary to make an initial mix of the band's tracks, the sound of which is therefore not only compressed but also reduced to mono, to leave enough space for the strings and brass arrangements. Despite having an excellent pedigree, including collaborations with Cat Stevens, Diana Ross, and as an arranger of both the Goldfinger theme tune for the Bond film of the same name and the legendary erotic song Je t'aime, conductor Arthur Greenslade failed to get any of the compositions off the ground. If anything, he actually managed to smother whatever musical promise the album may have held, and Lou Warburton's brass sections only made matters worse. The production was also below par. The crystal quality of Gabriel's voice clearly stands out, as do the albeit restrained contributions on piano from Banks, but Phillips and Rutherford, on the other hand, despite some tasteful acoustic guitar playing, remain decidedly in the shade, with only the occasional foray on lead guitar by Ant and some evanescent bass work from Mike. In other words, not the greatestofdebuts, although it has to be said there were more than just a few mitigating factors, such as Jonathan King's excessive interference, the unacceptable time lapse between the recording and release and, above all, the very young age of the band members.
The songs. Song, where the sour turns to sweet. Phillips, this was more a Gabriel and Banks song. We tended to write in pairs, maybe a bit more so later on. Early on, Gabriel and Banks did most of the writing. They probably wrote most of this album. Mike didn't write much. I had a few guitar riffs. This is one of the early ones. Starting with finger clicking and a 3-chord piano riff, the song, which opens the debut album of the very young Genesis, immediately reveals the quality of Gabriel's voice with its intense timbre and soul feel. The musical accompaniment, built around a soft acoustic rhythm guitar and dominated by Tony Banks on piano, flows over a bass of maracas and tambourines. Genesis had previously recorded another version of this song, which was intended to be released as a single, a plan that never materialized, along with another song, the hypothetical B-side, called From the Bottom of a Well. Phillips, Jonathan King led us to do that just after we signed a publishing contract, with the idea of making a single. At Advision Studios, probably August 1967, I remember I wore my caftan from Tangier, and Jonathan King said, "Oh, you're such a flower child." No one's ever come across that recording. I don't know whether Advision exists anymore, but they might have tapes there. It's worth trying to find out. If the studio doesn't exist, you'll have to find out where the tapes went. Jonathan King might have them. At the end of the song, electronic sounds link the first track to the following one. The linking pieces of music, which act as bridges between the songs, feature on almost the whole album, maybe to reinforce the idea of it being a concept. Phillips. The links were mainly hymns that we all loved. Funnily enough, Charterhouse asked me to write a piece of music for the school's 4th centenary. They asked Peter and Tony to write something too, but they probably weren't interested.
Song, in the beginning. The introduction to the second track is well and truly in the territory of psychedelia. Phillips. That's very 60s, that sound. It's like something from Doctor Who. I've no idea what made that noise at the beginning, but this song was based on a guitar riff of mine. An insistent bass riff overlying the dialogue between rhythm guitar, piano, and percussion is the foundation supporting Gabriel's voice, whereas at the end of each verse, a psychedelic electric guitar riff by Phillips stands out. Phillips, I used just fuzz. There weren't any phase pedals back then. It was tape phasing. Phasing is a technique whereby two instruments record the same part, but slightly out of sync, creating a pleasant effect, where you put your hands on the tape to slow it down and cause that strange sound. Nowadays, you can go to the shop and buy any kind of pedal for any effect. It was a very ambitious song, where we were tracing history. It was really over the top, actually. Song, fireside song, here. The linking piece is a somber piano solo by Tony. Phillips. This is a choral hymn that we used to sing in church by someone called Herbert Howells. We loved his music. The song, on the other hand, based on acoustic rhythm guitar and strings, stands out for Gabriel's soft vocal performance, supported in the chorus by Aunt Phillips. We sound very upper class here. People always joked about this one. But it's a very nice song. It was mainly Tony's song, and we added a bit. The one thing you really notice is how badly the guitar is recorded because it's all plectrum. Whereas on the next album, Trespass, I had my own sound, and I insisted on how I recorded. I even had a big argument with Robin Cable, the engineer, because he said it didn't sound like a 12-string. Everyone used to use a 12-string like a percussion instrument, like a washboard. And what you hear is KSHH, 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 as opposed to the notes. If you record the microphone on the soundboard, you just pick up the plectrum. If you take the mic further away, it gets the whole sound. And they, the sound engineers, were always putting it too close, and I'd always be pushing it away when they weren't looking. Song, The Serpent. After a psychedelic link with percussion and acid guitars playing a riff that would be used again years later in Twilight Alehouse, The Serpent turns out to be a remake of the first song ever written by Banks and Gabriel, She Is Beautiful, with a joint electric guitar and bass riff and Banks' organ enveloping Gabriel's voice with a rhythm and blues feel. Phillips. This is the song Jonathan King signed us for. Also, because, to be honest, the others were all rubbish. I'm not sure about the backing harmonies there. This is very much a Gabriel and Banks song. Am I very wrong? After another piano intro, another hymn, explains Phillips, but I'm not sure who this one is by. We weren't particularly religious. We just liked the hymns and tunes. The song is divided into two sections. In the first part, the voice is intense, and Gabriel lays the vocals softly over the acoustic guitars and strings. Whereas in the chorus, the lead vocals seem to disappear, leaving room for his companions' voices, Ant's in particular. Phillips. I don't know if Peter is singing in the chorus or not. Our friend, David Thomas, was also singing here. He did a lot of the backing harmonies. He sang a lot. He probably should have been paid some money, actually, but nobody was paid anything at the time. We stayed at his flat. That's where everybody lived during that summer. There was one night, I don't remember why, when 17 people stayed in that two-bedroomed flat and John Silver slept in the bath. I think it was when the album was finished. This song is quite Beatles-ish. It works quite well. It's quite an odd song, really, because the chorus is completely different. The song is in a very minor key, kind of desolate, quite sultry, while the chorus is very jolly. Songs. In the Wilderness, this track is a ballad mainly for piano and voice, with a little bass, which gains body during the chorus preceded by catchy strings with enjoyable rhythm guitar and drums. Phillips. This is mainly mine. Peter obviously did the vocals. A lot of friends used to like it. They used to call it Raindrops and ask us why it wasn't a single. It's quite commercial and catchy, isn't it? This could have been a single. The band has never been happy with the orchestral overdubs imposed by King. Phillips. Back then, to add the strings meant reducing everything else to mono, so the whole album sounded very weak. We had no control. Song, The Conqueror. Flipping the album over to side 2, conceptual continuity is provided by the electric guitar picking up from the track that ended side 1, In the Wilderness. The Conqueror, with its triumphant tones, emphasized by Gabriel's rich voice and the harmonies of the others, is based on a riff made up of 5 low notes on the piano, with the beat provided by the acoustic guitars, drums, and tambourines. Phillips. We used a lot of tambourine in those days. It was a very 60s thing, all this tambourine, but we didn't all play it. Probably Pete, and maybe I had a go. I couldn't stay on time, though. But mostly it was John Silver. I hadn't heard this song for a long time. This was very much a Peter and Tony song. The guitar sounds better. There's not a lot of plectrum. This is a bit more like Dylan, especially that vocal line. Quite monotone, all around a few notes. You could imagine Dylan doing this in a completely different way. Slower. A bit rougher. Shall we get Dylan to do a cover of it? Bob Dylan sings Genesis? I don't think it will happen somehow. Whilst Bob Dylan singing Genesis may seem unlikely, The Conqueror has recently received acclaim from an even more improbable source, Noel Gallagher of Oasis. Gallagher's song If Love Is the Law, which featured on Noel Gallagher's High Flying Birds 2017 album, Who Built the Moon, was heavily influenced by The Conqueror. Interviewed by Steve Lamacq on BBC Radio 6, Gallagher said, "There are at least 6 great songs on that first Genesis album." Song, In Hiding. Previously called Patricia, in the instrumental version recorded for the first demo by the still-to-be-called Genesis, this song is all Ant, his first ever composition. Phillips, My First Crush on a Girl. I was 13. It had a lot of versions before it ended up on the album. It kept appearing as this and appearing as that. I made some attempts to write lyrics for it, but they were all bad. The atypical structure of the song starts with the chorus sung by Gabriel and Phillips over the acoustic guitars with a waltz time signature. The verses, on the other hand, are sung only by Gabriel with the support of the orchestra. Phillips, I don't remember these strings. I realize I've hardly ever listened to this one since it was recorded. The strings are not too bad, but they could have been better. This is quite commercial. This could have been a single. It's certainly a lot better than some of the things that were hits back then. I like Peter's voice here. His voice is really good. I mean, of course, it's good later, but I don't remember it being this good back then. In Hiding is one of the 2 songs which, shortly after the album was recorded in November 1968, and Mike, Peter, and Tony mimed to in the BBC studios for Brian Roberts, who, as part of a training course, was required to film a short piece to illustrate what he had learned. Phillips, he was working as a trainee cameraman up at Evesham. We went up there and did a couple of songs to help him. It was also an experience for us. Unfortunately, the tape was probably recycled. To date, it has never been found. Song, One Day. Distant acoustic guitars supported by strings give way to the piano, which leads the instrumental part of the song. In the chorus, Gabriel's voice is boosted by solemn harmonies, the drums, and even the brass section conducted by Lou Warburton. Phillips, I don't remember that introduction at all. I don't think I ever listened to it once they put the strings on it. I didn't want to listen to it ever again. I've heard bits of tracks, obviously. This is a really good song. I'm not sure about the chorus so much, but the verse is very pretty. It was always very flowery and pretty. The arrangements are fine, but we couldn't have big strings. It was just one single line, which is a bit restricted. Song, Window. After another piano intro, sounds very Chinese. Phillips, Window features a massive brass section with an acoustic rhythm guitar and solid vocal performance. Other vocals appear in the chorus as well as strings, with the rhythmic support of the drums in the final fade-out. This song was composed on the roof of David Thomas's house. Phillips, Mike and I wrote this pretty much together. I'm sure Peter wrote the lyrics. I don't remember that horn. I've not listened to it since. That's really the truth. I always have what I call a 2-year rule. When I finish an album, I don't listen to it for 2 years, then it all sounds okay. In this case, it's been 40 years though. The rearrangements aren't bad. Now I can see why Jonathan King thought it needed these extra parts. But the problem was the recording at the time, which meant, to free up the tracks needed for the orchestra, everything had to go to mono. The 12-string is very bad again. It's very clicky. Pete's voice sounds good. Song, In Limbo. Starting with another piano intro. I think that's me playing with Tony, says Phillips. This is a lively song with a brass section again, as well as the acoustic guitar. In the chorus, you can hear the others harmonizing, especially Aunt Phillips. I always liked this song. It was written by Tony and Peter. The horns don't work on this though. It is very punchy. When we were doing this track, it was powerful. But the backing track sounds really small, and the brass is sort of stuck out in the middle of nowhere. There's a terrible trumpet note there, all out of tune. The sustained trumpet note can be heard at 2 feet 42 inches. It should have been re-recorded. Something's different on this one. I remember when we mixed together the brass and strings, we pushed all the backing track over to one side, and the horn parts were left in the middle by themselves. That's what seems to be happening on this song. It's more extreme. Anyway, this could have been better. Song, Silent Sun. The piano plays a riff on which the vocals and Chris Stewart's drums, not credited on the original release, come in immediately. In the second verse, Gabriel's voice deliberately emulates that of Robin Gibb, with the addition of other vocal timbres in the choruses while the strings go crazy. Phillips, this is Jonathan King trying to make us commercial. I've never liked this song. I find it irritating. He wanted us to have a hit. I understand that, but I didn't like it. Song, A Place to Call My Own. A song written by Phillips on the piano, but played by Banks and sung by Gabriel, with a lovely and heartbreaking melody, which gets cut after just over a minute to leave space for an orchestral conclusion driven by the brass section, the harmonies of the whole group, and a bass loop. Phillips, this was a 5-minute epic that got cut down to just this bit. I had nothing to do with the orchestral part. The album artwork. A completely black cover. In the top left corner yellow, lowercase Gothic lettering spells out, From Genesis to Revelation. This is how the band's first album looked, with graphics apparently leading many shops to mistakenly place it in the religious section. Jonathan King confirms that this happened. Absolutely true. It killed us. King's choice of cover art was in part due to the ongoing confusion over the legitimacy of the band's name after it was discovered that another band called Genesis already existed in America, whose first album, published in 1968, was Irony, Callie called I N the B Gin and G. Inside the cover, the first words seek to explain the arcane. The group started as Genesis, biblical centuries ago. But fate intervened, other groups became Genesis, and who are we to fight? So we changed our name in America to Revelation. Moments later up came another revelation. Now we are the group without a name, but we have a record and we want to give it to you, name or not. And then goes on to say, those years between 15 and 20. No longer boy or girl, not yet man or woman. Confused by the bright light of age, remembering the hazy mellowness of youth. Years when one tries to go back, forwards, upwards, downwards, never to remain static, at peace in growing up. The original inner sleeve was decorated with a series of drawings inspired by the Bible, serpents, rain, landscapes, mythological figures. Epilogue. The album was recorded in August 1968, but only made it into record stores 7 months later in March 1969. An incomprehensible time lapse for an up-and-coming band and for that time in general. Phillips, that was down to Jonathan King. He thought about it and thought about it some more and in the end decided that it needed more. Then sometime around October or November, he decided it needed strings, and they got added some time around Christmas or just after. I think we heard it in February and I got a terrible shock. It sounded so different, so strange. So I think he just slept on it, sat on it, thought about it. Probably played it to a few different people who maybe said it needed something extra. So he then had to get somebody to write the orchestral parts, and that would have taken a couple of weeks. So the record wasn't actually finished until the end of August, early September. So he probably spent a couple of months thinking about it, adding the strings, and then released it in March. It sold 600 copies, and we virtually knew everyone who bought it. Despite their first single receiving positive reviews, the lack of sales resulted in Jonathan King and Decca immediately losing interest in the band, and Genesis quickly found themselves without a contract. Banks, I went to university for a year, then I sort of took a year off and then another. I think my parents always hoped I'd go back. I felt this was an opportunity, musical, that would only come once. I thought about not doing it, and then I thought, I really would miss this. I really, really want to do this. There's a chance, even if at the time it was an incredibly slim chance. Gabriel, John Silver, the drummer after Chris Stewart, a wonderful guy, as is Chris, was very good at encouraging us to develop an individual personality and push the folk thing. I mean, he was a sort of a jazz fan really in lots of ways. He dropped out because of parental pressure and ended up at Cornell University in America. He said afterwards he was hoping he'd get a letter inviting him back, whereas we just thought, okay, that's what he's decided to do, fair enough. Phillips. On listening to the album, I'm pleasantly surprised at how it sounds. The only song I thought sounded rubbish was In Limbo, although I like the actual song. But overall it stood up pretty well. I was listening to some Neil Young stuff from the 60s, with Crazy Horse from about 67, 68. I thought his stuff was pretty rough. This album compares very favorably to that. Some of the songs are really nice. The lyrics were a bit early, a bit naive, but Pete's vocals sound very good. This revised opinion from Phillips is welcomed by Jonathan King. Good for Ant. I think it's a great album and works tremendously. Still, over 40 years later, it's a delightful, innocent, charming album by very young lads starting out on their careers. From Genesis to Revelation was released in March 1969 and barely sold over 600 copies. The band members were bitterly disappointed, even more so as Jonathan King had already lost all interest and neither he nor Decca Records believed in them anymore. The following weeks were a time of reflection during which a number of things happened. First and foremost, parental interference began to set in. Now that these 18-year-old musicians had had the satisfaction of making a record, their parents were expecting them to go back to studying and prepare for a life more in keeping with their upbringing. In fact, during the months preceding the release of their debut album, which as we have already seen was recorded during the summer of the previous year, Tony Banks had been accepted into Sussex University to read physics, mathematics, and philosophy. Mike had moved on to the Farnborough College of Technology and Peter and Ant had decided to carry on and get more levels. Peter had also been accepted into the London School of Film Technique, now the London Film School. During this period of despondency, however, the band continued to rehearse hoping they could prove their worth on stage. Thanks to a parental loan of £150, they managed to buy an organ, a bass guitar, and an amplifier and rehearsed in their own homes or at friends' houses, including Brian Roberts' grandmother's house, Brian, as you will remember. Being the friend who worked in a recording studio, these sessions gave rise to new inspiration, some of which came together in The Movement, a lengthy piece that was never professionally recorded, while songs in the existing repertoire were further perfected. But things were still very much in a state of flux, whilst the most skeptical band members, Banks and Gabriel, had now decided to carry on. Matters were suddenly made worse in July, when drummer John Silver decided to leave for good. John Silver, there was an institution, part of the British Empire, which encouraged English youngsters to go abroad, be it Australia, Canada, the US, South Africa, anywhere. So I got a grant and I went to Cornell University, a very big Ivy League university in upstate New York. It's a liberal arts college and I originally went to the hotel school. I double majored with economics and did the first 2 years of an MBA before coming back to England. The bespectacled drummer left the band with few regrets. Silver, we had made an album and in those days that wasn't something you could just go out and do. It was only the result of luck and the connections Jonathan King had in Decca. We rehearsed, and so I got to meet famous pop stars. I got to phone my mother and tell her to switch on the radio because my record was going to be aired. These were big moments in life. There was a lot of excitement. The single came out, the album came out. Later, I left the band to go to university in America. I remember there was an important television program back then called The Old Grey Whistle Test in London. The deal was that if we got on this program, I would stop university, come right back, and we'd be in business again. I didn't tell my family the whole story, but basically, that was the important development that never materialized. I tried to promote the record in America. I contacted London Records in New York and said, "Hey, I live in New York at the university. This is a fantastic record. When is it going to be released?" But nothing. Absolutely nothing. They wrote a very nice letter saying, "Yes, it is very nice, but we have no plans to release it." And in those days, the mechanics of production and releasing were very different to today. If they said they weren't going to release it, that was that. I had the only copies of the first album in America. So I took a few of these records around the radio stations, again to try and promote the English pop revolution. I told them it was a fantastic record and he did some interviews on the local stations. They played the tracks and again, nobody was interested in the material at all. And so I stayed in America and the band eventually got a replacement. Despite the ongoing confusion, Genesis had no intention of giving up. The first step was to place a drummer wanted ad in Melody Maker. Phillips. 1969 was the summer of many drummers, many adverts, many auditions, people being picked up from stations, who's gonna tell him, and all that sort of stuff. It was absolutely awful because we loved John Silver, and he had decided to pack it up and go to university in the States. John Mayhew, on the other hand, was older than us. He was more experienced. He was from a different background, and he was very unsure of himself. We tried to do our best to make him feel comfortable. I'm not sure we ever did. John Mayhew, born in Ipswich, March 27, 1947, I'd left my telephone number around London. The telephone rang while I was at work. When I got home, my wife said a guy called Mike Rutherford had called from a band named Genesis, and as soon as I heard that name, Genesis, I knew for sure that this was special. Mike phoned back at 6 o'clock, and he was trying to persuade me to join the band because they weren't famous then. They were very small. And so I said, yeah, I'll come and audition. I took a train from Woking down to Farnham. I remember I was dressed in black, and I had a whole drum kit. I don't know how I did it. It was more baggage than anybody else was carrying. Anyway, they turned up in a taxi and Peter Gabriel was in the back writing lyrics on bits of paper. I looked at the sky and thought, he's a hard worker. They were all hard workers. Following the recruitment of John Mayhew on drums, the first step was to record another couple of demos in August 1969. The first in Regent Sound Studios, White Mountain, Family, Pasadena, and Going Out to Get You. Only the latter of which ever saw the light of day when it was released as part of the Genesis Archive 1967-75 box set, and the second at the Phillips family house, Send Barnes, Stagnation, Stranger, The Movement, and Little Leaf. On Monday, September 22nd, again at Send Barnes, the whole band started rehearsing for 2 weeks. During the middle weekend, 27 to 28 September, Peter, Tony, and John went home while Mike and Aunt stayed behind to record the demos for a couple of songs. The band rehearsals came to an end on Friday, October 3rd, making it highly likely that the following day, Saturday, October 4th, was the day Genesis made its live debut in the household of the Baum family, Peter Gabriel's neighbors. One of the Baum children, Anthony, was going to be 21 on October 27th. But to date, no research has been able to prove with any certainty that Genesis actually played at the Baum home for his birthday, and not for a different occasion on this earlier date. The performance, for which the band were paid £25, was an important event, even if it was hardly a roaring success. The numerous guests were more interested in partying and making friends than in listening to a young and unknown band. And yet, the publication of a manuscript in the first edition of Armando Gallo's book, Genesis, The Evolution of a Rock Band, sheds a little light on a period about which little is known. The document is a set list drawn up for the Baum party, written out by Peter Gabriel himself. On the left side of the page, there are 34 songs listed: Black Sheep, Going Out to Get You, Eastern Magic Boogie, The Serpent, In Limbo, Build Me a Mountain, Digby, Masochistic Man, Crossroads, Stumble, Chobham Chords, Do I Still Figure in Your Life, Sitting on the Top of the World, Nice, Visions of Angels, White Mountain, Pasadena, Family, Shepherd, Classic, Wandering, Babies, Let Us Now Make Love, Classic, Window, Grandma, Little Leaf, In Hiding, One Day, Conqueror, Stranger, Silver Song, Epic. Think Again. While on the right side there is a shortened version of the list with 26 songs divided up into 4 sets. The right-hand column, which is headed order, may well have been the concert schedule with 3 interludes. First set, In the Beginning, Serpent, Going Out to Get You, Masochistic Man, Stumble, Black Sheep, Visions of Angels. Second set, Build Me a Mountain, In Limbo, Sitting on the Top of the World, Key to Love, Chobham Chords, Digby, Nice. Third set, Little Leaf, Pasadena, Family, White Mountain, Window, Stranger, Babies. Fourth and last set, Movement, One Day, Grandma, Let Us Now Make Love, Conqueror. Although obviously, there is no way of knowing for sure whether or not these songs were actually played at the Baum family event, the list without doubt represents the repertoire from which early Genesis selected their songs for later concerts. Comparing the two lists written out on the piece of paper, as well as the title classic appearing twice, one notices the 9 songs which were left out of the list featuring 4 sets compared to the full list of songs on the left-hand side. These songs were probably dropped at the last minute, but there's a chance some of them were actually performed, especially songs like In Hiding and Shepherd. On the other hand, it is highly likely that the song Silver Song, written by Ant and Mike as attribute to their previous drummer, John Silver, was left out. The pair did, however, go on to record the song, with Phil Collins on drums and vocals, in 1973. This version was finally released in 2008 on a reissue of The Geese and the Ghost. A look at the set list reveals the presence of 6 songs from the debut album: In the Beginning, Serpent, In Limbo, Window, One Day, Conqueror, plus 3 more recorded in the same period which didn't make it to the track list, Going Out to Get You. Visions of Angels, Build Me a Mountain. Some of these songs would appear on the following album: Trespass, the already mentioned Visions of Angels in a completely new version, and White Mountain, Family, and Nice, the latter 2 under the new titles of Dusk and The Knife, whereas others would only be released years later on Genesis Archive 1967-75, Shepherd, Passity, and Let Us Now Make Love. The lengthy song The Movement has already been mentioned, and some covers were destined to be excluded from the set list immediately after the event: The Stumble by Freddie King, Black Sheep by the American band SRC, Key to Love by John Mayall, and Sitting on the Top of the World written by Walter Vinson and Lonnie Chapman, released in 1930 and later made famous by Cream, which leaves half a dozen tracks still to be discussed, all of which were destined to quickly disappear not only from the set list, but from the history of Genesis as a whole. A couple of these were the work of Anthony Phillips, such as Stranger, which the guitarist went on to release years later, and which he says was only ever played at the Baum Party, and Little Leaf, a song which was actually quite important in the early stages of Genesis' career. Predominantly acoustic with Tony Banks starting out on guitar, it was often used as a bridge to the more rhythmic section of the show.
Another acoustic song, destined to be discarded as early as the winter of '69 in order to make way for something a little more up-tempo, was Grandma, whereas Digby, also known as Digby of the Rambling Lake, was a song by Tony which he says was partially recycled at a later date. The rest of the songs were in all likelihood by Peter Gabriel, most definitely Masochistic Man and Babies, and very probably Chobham Chords. Having passed the acid test of their first ever live performance, albeit at a private party, Genesis were all set to put on some real stage shows shortly afterwards. Their first proper concert was on November 4th at the Brunel University London campus in Acton, in West London. Here the band was spotted by the secretary of the Twickenham Technical College, who signed them up to support Black Cat Bones on the 15th for the fee of £50, all of which went on repairing the van after Richard McPhail, driver, friend, and General Dog's Body, crashed it. Phillips, we used to start with in the beginning, including at the first big gig where all the agents came. That time my strings were completely out of tune. It was in that break, I was just turning in panic. During this period, Genesis often had the difficult task of opening for much better-known artists. On November 23rd, at the Kingston Hotel, Poblocto were headlining and bass player Steve Glover asked to borrow Mike's bass. Caught up in his own enthusiasm, Glover broke 2 of the strings, taking Genesis' already fragile finances almost to breaking point. The last concert of November, on the 28th, was at the Woolwich Polytechnic. Headliners, Caravan, had cancelled and were replaced by bluesman Jimmy Witherspoon. Genesis, Steve Miller's Delivery, and Gun Hill were billed as support bands, and the evening ended with a striptease. During this stage in the band's history, they were mainly playing the university circuit around the capital, but at long last, in December, they got a couple of gigs on 2 consecutive nights over 120 miles further north, near Birmingham. On the first night, Genesis were expected to entertain the workers of Nettlefolds Limited, a well-known company which manufactured metal fasteners. Needless to say, they did not go down very well. However, 1970 got off on a whole new footing, starting with two important dates. On January 9th, Genesis were hired by the BBC to write the soundtrack for a documentary on the painter Michael Jackson. Although the documentary was never finished during this session, which would only surface in 2008 in the Genesis 1970 to 1975 box set, the band recorded 4 short pieces from which they would draw heavily in the following months. On February 22nd, the band returned to the BBC studios for the radio program Night Ride. In front of DJ Alec Reed, the band played 6 songs live in the studio. Although, unfortunately, no trace of Dusk remains, the other 5 tracks, Shepherd, Passity, Let Us Now Make Love, Looking for Someone, and Stagnation, reappeared as bootlegs in the mid-1990s, and, later on, the first 3 of these were released on Genesis Archive 1967-75. During the first 2 months of the year, Genesis were still a support act, but for bigger bands if nothing else. In fact, they opened for Roy Harper, Atomic Rooster, T-Rex, and Rare Bird amongst others, and had their debut on the stage of the legendary Marquee Club in London on February 4th, supporting Keith Hartley. But things didn't always go to plan. For example, at the private event organized at the Hullingham Tennis Club in Fulham, Genesis were completely ignored in the Where Your Dreams Festival, where they were scheduled to play alongside big names such as The Doors, Led Zeppelin, Frank Zappa, Pink Floyd, and The Who, to name just a few. At Crystal Palace on February 11th, was cancelled. On the 20th, Genesis opened for free, but the venue was so small that Phillips had to keep moving out of the way for people to go to and from the toilets while he was playing. The turning point finally arrived after Night Ride, when Genesis played 2 concerts on the same day at the Queen Mary College, London. The first was in a small upstairs room, but the second was on the main stage, an honor Genesis managed to achieve over the half-dozen or so bands on the bill, thanks to television producer Marcus Bicknell, who was one of the band's first fans. Here, for the first time ever, the audience seemed really interested in what Genesis were doing. Singer-songwriter Nick Drake, who was at the show, was particularly keen on Let Us Now Make Love, which he defined as dangerous. After the Uxbridge concert on the 27th, where the audience clearly preferred Genesis over the headliners, Fairport Convention, Bicknell resolved to organize a tour of 7 concerts in clubs in and around London from February 25th to March 3rd, which was also advertised in Melody Maker. Alas, the venues didn't always turn out to be very suitable for live events. Often they were clubs which were so small that, at Blazes on the 26th, for example, while playing Little Leaf, Mike accidentally lifted a girl's skirt with his cello bow. The last of these concerts, the one on March 3rd, was at Ronnie Scott's, a famous jazz club in the heart of Soho. Genesis performed in the upstairs venue and were so popular that they were confirmed a slot for the next 6 consecutive Tuesdays. This was the best place to get spotted because record producers, managers, and talent scouts were often present, and it mattered very little that there was so much confusion that Gabriel was able to sing a song for which the lyrics had yet to be written called, on the spur of the moment, I've Been Traveling All Night Long. And while they were continuing with their live schedule, which by this point had become rather hectic, Genesis were still desperately trying to obtain a record deal. It was during this period that contact was made with Threshold Records, the Moody Blue Zone label, which seemed very interested. Genesis were called into the D. Lane Leah Studios in Holborn on March 8th. Here, under the supervision of Moody Blues keyboard player Mike Pinder and record producer Tony Clark, they spent the whole day and night recording. The band finished at 6 in the morning and then had to drive all the way to Sunderland, where they had a gig booked for that same day in a rather oddly decorated ballroom where Ant had to play under a plastic palm tree. Between performances at Ronnie Scott's, Genesis had the chance to play at the Atomic Sunrise Festival at the Roundhouse. This was a week-long festival, 9 to 15 March, with input from Yoko Ono. Anyone who was anyone in the London rock scene was invited. The idea was to combine musical performances with those of the Living Theatre, an American experimental theater company. The festival bill included some big names such as Hawk Wind, Quintessence, Kevin Ayers, Brian Auger, and Arthur Brown, to name but a few. On Wednesday 11th, Genesis were billed as openers for David Bowie. Despite all the publicity, the performance didn't get as much attention as it should have. Gabriel, there were more performers on the stage than there were in the audience. Even though David Bowie and Genesis were both playing on the same night, which was very strange because we were both beginning to get some momentum. The fact that the concerts, at least in part, were both recorded and filmed, as announced by the press at that time, was only confirmed in 1978 with the American promo disc used by Earth News. Peter Gabriel was promoting his second solo album, and, during the chat, a snippet of Twilight Alehouse from the Roundhouse was aired. 43 years later, on 11 and March 12, 2013, the film was finally screened in the Roundhouse, showing the full performance of the knife and looking for someone in very good quality, albeit without the original sound. To put music to the footage, film director-producer Adrian Everett used the studio version of the first song and the Night Ride radio performance of the second. This film is of great historical value, as it is the only footage featuring Genesis with Phillips and Mayhew in the lineup, only a small fragment of which would later appear on the DVD some of the parts. Despite interest from Island Records in the person of producer Guy Stevens, and after coming close to signing a contract with Threshold Records, Genesis were eventually signed to Charisma Records, the up-and-coming record label founded by Tony Stratton Smith. From here onwards, the band's rise to fame was slow but sure. One important step was meeting David Stopes, the promoter of the famous Friars Club in Aylesbury, where Genesis played for the first time on April 13, 1970, receiving unprecedented enthusiasm from the audience. This concert marked the beginning of the band's special connection with the Aylesbury audience, and they returned there several times over the following months. In the following weeks, Genesis increased their number of live appearances, still mainly in the role of support band, but increasingly to famous names such as Fairport Convention, Mott the Hoople, and Deep Purple. Occasionally, Genesis were themselves supported by artists who went on to achieve a high profile. Nick Drake, for example, opened for Genesis on at least one occasion. Banks. In 1970, there were an awful lot of clubs and places where you could just play, supporting some other group, in front of maybe 80 to 90 people, sometimes less. When we headlined, we were sometimes playing to as few as 5 or 6 people. But you had a chance to learn your craft, and you could just about get enough money to keep yourself going. Phillips. We felt very junior to the other bands. Very, very junior. We really didn't know whether we had anything at all. You'd get one bloke coming down saying he really liked it. I remember somebody coming down saying he was quite knocked out. And we had all these different agents coming to see us. So there were good gigs and bad gigs, and we didn't really know what we had. To be honest, we used to look at King Crimson. When we mentioned King Crimson, 'twas like they'd seen the Messiah, and we knew we had to try harder. Someone would bring us all these reviews of Yes by Chris Welch, and we'd think, God, we're nowhere. I think we were very unsure of ourselves, and what often happens is that you overcompensate. I know we were called snotty-nosed bastards by somebody at Leicester University, but we weren't going around being arrogant. The constantly evolving set list changed quite radically as the weeks went by. Phillips, whether it was either Wild University gigs on a Friday night, or else the Revolution or Blazes clubs filled with arms dealers and shades and stuff, they weren't interested in our Ponzi kind of acoustic stuff. So all we could do is stamp on them with volume, so a lot of the more sensitive stuff got wiped out. When it came to recording the album, Trespass, we were bored stiff of always playing the same thing. We'd been doing it for 9 months nonstop, and we would have liked to do some different music, but there was no question of it. It had got to the point where it was like an orchestra going out and doing the New World Symphony every night, because hardly a note changed. I was lucky in that I had a solo in the knife where I could change a few notes. I mean, it was exciting if the audience were really keen and reinvented it for you, but most of the time they didn't know who we were. You must know the famous time O Fuss playing a gig to just one person where Peter Gabriel just gave up and said, "Any requests?" The total lack of any recordings of these concerts unfortunately makes it impossible to surmise as to what the set lists may have been. It is well known, however, that the first part of the concerts focused on acoustic pieces, dominated by Ant and Mike's 12-string guitar parts, occasionally joined by Banks, with the interesting addition of Rutherford on cello, on Pasadena and Little Leaf, and Gabriel on accordion. Phillips, Peter used to play it on Stagnation. That was one of the more bizarre things live. I remember once he put the accordion down during the quiet section, but didn't put it down properly, so it started playing during the quiet bit by itself, like bagpipes when they finished. Some interesting songs to be remembered from this period. Let Us Now Make Love, with an electric guitar part played by Tony Banks. filtering Ant's Stratocaster through his Leslie cabinet. Little Leaf. Banks would start out on guitar before switching to the organ and sing the song with Rutherford in an attempt to emulate, without success, the harmonies of Simon and Garfunkel, White Mountain, Twilight Alehouse, Family, Alias Dusk, and Shepherd, with, for a couple of lines of the lyrics, an exceptionally rare vocal solo by Banks. As the concert progressed, as already mentioned, the set would become more up-tempo. Songs like Digby and Jamaican Longboat disappeared whilst In the Wilderness and a harder version of Limbo remained, and Looking for Someone was rearranged. Phillips. I can't remember how we played the instrumental part. Live it was pretty powerful, but being as we didn't have a piano on the stage, Tony had to do it with the organ. After Pasadena, usually somewhere towards the end of the set, the concerts ended on the heaviest songs of all, Going Out to Get You and Nice, alias The Knife. In the meantime, Gabriel was getting more confident in his role of frontman. During his earlier shows, he was so shy that a friend of the band, MacPhail, had to introduce the songs for him. But now he was starting to invent surreal stories to tell the audience while the others stunned their 12-string guitars. In April, however, Anthony started to feel unwell. His poor health caused a slowdown in band activity, and after the concert on April 25th at Imperial College, London, they took a 3-week break so that Ant could go to Cornwall with his parents and convalesce. All the concerts planned for May had to be cancelled, including those for which posters and newspaper ads still exist, such as the one at Ronnie Scott's on the 5th, Canterbury on the 8th. Genesis should have opened for The Who, Twickenham on the 9th, Stockport on the 15th, Guildford on the 16th, Southall on the 23rd, and the famous Marquee Club in London on the 24th. With May behind them, during which the cause of Ant's ill health had been diagnosed as glandular fever, Genesis went back to performing in front of a live audience at the beginning of June with a concert at the Gin Mill Club in Godalming, where they would also rehearse before going into the studio to record Trespass. On June 14th, the band finally returned to performing regular live shows, starting at the Marquee. They even played 2 gigs in one day, June 27th, first at the Surrey Free Festival in Guildford in the afternoon, where the band played in Amarquee, which collapsed right in the middle of their show, then Dalston in the evening. Unfortunately, Phillips' health didn't seem to be improving, and the guitarist started to toy with the idea of leaving the band, something he first mentioned to his longtime friend, Mike Rutherford, after the concert at Kingston Polytechnic on July 9th. The decision to quit was officially announced to the whole band on July 18th at the end of the Haywards Heath concert. And so it was that Anthony Phillips left Genesis. What few other concerts had been planned were cancelled, and a new phase in the history of Genesis was about to begin.